This story is about a man named Sanger Rainsford, who by chance ends up on an island owned by General Zaroff. At first glimpse, the General is a decent man, a hunter like Rainsford. But as we discover, what the General hunts is an animal, it's man. Rainsford is sent out into the jungle to be hunted by the General. After Rainsford tries several failed attempts to trap and kill the General, and with the General and his dogs closing in, he jumps into a stream and travels up to beat the General back to his home, where he waits to kill him in his bedroom. At first people can say it's man versus man. Then people can say it's man versus himself. You shut up. No. You shut up. Or even man versus beast. You suck. But then again, everyone is right. The story is a combination of all three. Rainsford versus the General is man versus man. Rainsford has to believe in himself, which is man versus himself. And Rainsford versus the dog, which is, although very minor, they are still a big threat, and that is, of course, man versus beast. The major theme or issue in this story is how Ward devalued human life in Zaroff's eyes. This short story was based around the time of World War I, and both the General and Rainsford fought in World War I. The General was there by choice, it seemed, though. Maybe at this point he had started to grow tired of the regular hunt. But one can argue that the General perhaps did not anticipate the effect of going to war would have on a psychological well-being. As many people know, once you've killed something, it gets easier and easier to do it again. It demoralizes the value of life for the creature, whether it be a spider, or a fly, or a small mammal. At one point in time, it was challenging to kill the creature. For those of you who drive, you know the first time you hit something, you feel bad about it. Or at least you're supposed to. But as time goes on, and you encounter more and more suicidal squirrels, rabbits, and other small creatures, the effect of hearing them crunch beneath your tires becomes less and less repulsive, or less and less emotionally unsatisfying. With this, the same thing can be said for the General and war. Perhaps he killed so many men during the war that it no longer seemed repulsive to think about it. Perhaps, no, undoubtedly, he saw it as the same as killing large game. Another thing that goes hand in hand with war is shell shock, or more properly known as combat stress reaction. It was believed that the early symptoms of shell shock are tiredness, irritability, giddiness, lack of concentration, and headaches. Eventually, the men suffered mental breakdowns, making it impossible for them to remain in the front line. Some came to the conclusion that the soldiers' condition was caused by the enemy's heavy artillery. These doctors argued that the bursting shell created a vacuum, and when the air rushed into this vacuum, it disturbed the cerebrospinal fluid, and this upset the working of the brain. The most common symptoms of combat stress reaction are fatigue, slower reaction times, indecision, disconnection from one's surroundings, and inability to prioritize. The ratio of stress casualties to battle casualties varies with the intensity of fighting, but with intense fighting it can be as high as 1 to 1. In low-level conflicts it can be dropped to 1 to 10. In World War I, shell shock was considered to be a psychiatric illness resulting from injury to the nerves during combat. The horrors of World War I trench warfare meant that about 10% of the fighting soldiers were killed, opposed to 4.5% during World War II, and the total proportion of troops who became casualties was 56%. Whether a shell shock sufferer was considered wounded or sick depended on the circumstances. The large proportion of World War I veterans in the European population meant that the symptoms were common to the culture, although it may not have been properly known in the U.S. In current understanding, the long-term effects that some war veterans developed from the stress of combat are seen as a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a term for certain severe psychological consequences of exposure to or confrontation with stressful events that the person experiences as highly traumatic. Clinically, such events involve actual or threatening death, serious physical injury, or a threat to physical and or psychological integrity to a degree that usual psychological defense are incapable of coping with the impact. It is possible for individuals to experience traumatic stress without developing post-traumatic stress disorder, and also for people to experience traumatic situations and not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, most people who experience traumatic events will not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. For most people, the emotional effects of traumatic events will tend to subside after several months. PTSD is thought to be primarily an anxiety disorder and should not be confused with normal grief and adjustment after traumatic events. PTSD may be triggered by external factors. Its symptoms can include the following: nightmares, flashbacks, emotional detachment or numbing of feelings, like in Zeroff's case, insomnia, avoidance of reminders, and extreme distress when exposed to the reminders, the triggers, if you will, loss of appetite, irritability, hypervigilance, memory loss, excessive startle response, clinical depression, and anxiety. It is also possible for a person suffering from PTSD to exhibit one or more other psychiatric disorders. These disorders often include clinical depression, anxiety disorder, and a variety of additions. PTSD has 3 subforms. Acute PTSD subsides after a duration of 3 months. If the symptoms persist, the diagnostic is changed to chronic PTSD. The 3rd subform is referred to as delayed onset PTSD, which may occur months, years, or even decades after the event. It can be believed that the general had forms of chronic PTSD, which would help his mental well-being be disturbed enough to be able to use man as game. With the addition of my first theory, it would explain how someone in his situation can be so heartless or insane.